Alright ladies, this screencast is going to serve as an introduction into Unit 4. I'm presently realizing that it does not say Unit 4 on this PowerPoint. Please ignore that. That was a typo. But if you haven't done so already, please go to Moodle and download the Chapter 11 outline. So this unit's going to kind of focus on the turn of the century, immigration, industrialization, urbanization, reform movements, kind of leading into the early 1900s with World War I. So we're going to first focus on immigration in today's screencast. So there are a new number of immigrants coming over. Large numbers are coming, as well as people from different parts of the world. So who are these people and where are they coming from? So Europeans are immigrating in large numbers. They are mainly arriving on the east coast of the United States. Think about how you would get to America from Europe. You would likely cross the Atlantic, so you'd come through into the east coast. The difference and the change in immigration we're seeing in terms of European immigrants is that before, you know, late 1800s, most of the European immigrants are coming from like Northern and Western Europe. And now we're starting to see them coming more from Eastern and Southern Europe. Think about countries like Italy, Austria-Hungary, Russia. These are newer immigrants that are coming like from further distances away from, into Europe to migrate into the United States. So again, the new European immigrants are coming from Central and Eastern Southern Europe. You also see an increased number of Asian immigration. There are large numbers of Asian immigrants coming into the United States, particularly from China and Japan. These immigrants will, of course, cross the Pacific Ocean, so they will come into the West Coast, into California. Many of them coming because of the gold rush, but inevitably, most of them will end up working on the railroad system from the western side. Like with the Transcontinental Railroad construction happening, they'll work on the railroad system in the west. Keep them in mind because we'll talk about them more in a second. You also have larger numbers of immigrants coming from the Caribbean and Mexico, and most of these immigrants are settling in the southeastern portion of the United States, such as Florida. So, not all immigrants arriving in the U.S. would be admitted and welcomed in. They first had to go to inspection stations. You're probably most familiar with the one on the East Coast called Ellis Island, outside of New York City, okay, where they would have to be kind of approved for entrance into the United States. They had a very similar immigration station on the West Coast outside of San Francisco called Angel Island. So Ellis Island is to the east, as Angel Island is to the west coast. Once immigrants came into the United States, they faced several challenges. They had to find a place to live, find a job, figure out a way to get along in daily life, keeping in mind that most of them do not speak English. So they're trying to figure out all these things without speaking the spoken language in the United States. So because of these challenges, many immigrants will kind of seek out other people who share their cultural identities, values, speak their language, practice the same religion, and they'll kind of group themselves into little communities, like local communities, which is where you get like Italian Americans and Chinese Americans kind of grouping together, and they'll form little like boroughs and neighborhoods inside big cities such as New York, eventually Chicago, San Francisco. So if you know of like Chinatown or Little Italy, those, that was kind of little communities of those specific types of immigrants. People who are born and raised in the United States don't necessarily feel welcoming in terms of these new immigrants. They don't necessarily care for the new culture or the new identities being brought into the United States, and they honestly see it as a threat towards the American way of life. So we do see some restrictions coming out of immigration. First off, with the melting pot is a theory that, America's a mixture and a blend of all types of different cultures, races, identities, languages, cuisines, etc. And at times you hear a positive connotation with it, like America's a big melting pot, like we have so many variety of, identities and cultures and it's awesome. But in theory, when you have a melting pot, everything kind of melts together to create one universal identity. It kind of becomes like a mixture of people of different cultures and races who blend together by abandoning and kind of, their native languages and customs not necessarily get abandoned, but they do kind of get phased out to embrace the American identity. So if you want to focus on an analogy that kind of highlights the fact that we're all different and have different backgrounds and customs and cultures, you do the whole gumbo analogy instead of the melting pot, because the melting pot isn't necessarily the most positive connotation. But Americans are expecting these immigrants to kind of give up their former identities and make them secondary. And this is kind of leading into Americans being, opposed to immigration overall. So we're also going to see a rise of something called nativism. Nativism is this American ideology of favoritism towards American-born individuals. Basically, anti-immigration, pro-American-born. And those types of people typically think that, people who descended from England and are Western European are, quite frankly, superior to other races and other cultures. So it is kind of a superiority complex, this idea of nativism and prejudice against the immigrant and the foreigner. And it's going to lead to a push for further limitations placed on immigration. One particular group that's going to be targeted is the Chinese. And the reason that the Chinese were targeted specifically in the western part of the United States is that many laborers and just working class Americans living in the West felt that Chinese immigration posed a threat to their jobs because many Chinese immigrants were willing to work for less money. So they were taking a lot of the labor jobs away from American laborers because the American businesses are willing to pay the Chinese laborers at a lesser cost if they were willing to be paid at a lesser cost. Because there was so much violence in the West over Chinese immigration, Congress eventually is forced to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned entry to the United States for all Chinese citizens unless you were a student, an educator, a tourist, a government official. But in terms of just any average Chinese citizen migrating to the United States, they were cut off completely and banned from immigration. This happened in the 1880s, and it's actually going to exist until the 1940s. So it's very interesting that the first group that we target in terms of limiting immigration is actually an Asian group. Alright, if y'all have any questions about the screencast, let me know, and I will see you all tomorrow.